So I'm going to talk about sort of the trajectory of my practice, sort of how it's evolved over, the last sort of 14 years of my professional practice. But I'll focus particularly on one project, Kojo Women and Other Stories, that specifically involves working with institutional archives, also personal archives, found material, and that really embodies the interest I have in iterations of different work, which I'll talk about. But I wanted to start by talking about my first major project. It was actually my bachelor's thesis, which was the first kind of serious body of work I did. I worked on it for about 3 years. And it really set the foundation for me for my approach to photography and photographic materials, because I definitely would be described as, like, let's say, a process-oriented artist. So a little backdrop, kind of like Dominica mentioned, I do some printmaking. I have a letterpress lab. I love silkscreen. I work with some motion picture, a little bit of sculpture, creative writing. So I dabble in some of these things, but I remain very rooted in photography, and especially in analog technologies. I would sometimes describe myself as someone who's interested in this sort of contemporary expression of historical and analog processes. And so I use other mediums, but typically within photographic installations. I'm really interested in how other mediums can sort of uplift the sort of primary photo work. So I don't really call myself like a multidisciplinary artist, even though I am using multiple disciplines. But that being said, within photography, I would say I'm extremely diverse, extremely flexible. I shoot a variety of films and formats. There's very few formats I don't shoot. And I use a variety of processes and print surfaces. And I also combine a variety of subjects and genres. So it's never sort of just portraiture or just still life. It's always, every project is always a mixture of all of those things. Although I would say my sort of love is for portraiture. I mean, that's kind of the axis around which things tend to revolve. So this is my undergraduate work. So I'm interested in this idea of the emotional landscape, which of course is a broad term, but I would describe it as kind of experiential, really feeling-based work that kind of deals with, but isn't limited to, desire, longing, loss, and especially uncertainty. I'm gonna pound this word into the pavement during this talk, because this is really a primary interest for me, the experience of uncertainty, the role that it plays in our lives. So this project is a collection of these small integrated analog prints. They're really about 12 by 12 centimeters. They're super tiny. I've always been a small printer, maybe because I've also, aside from having access to commercial darkrooms, I always have a darkroom in my apartment. Right now I don't, but now because we have it in Svernoka, but I always sort of maintained a darkroom. And so printing small was natural for me, but I also loved the sort of very intimate experience of printing small. And I often even have started to go smaller, sometimes I'm making cropped prints from an 8 by 10 negative, so I love this sort of really small, intimate print. I like showing grids of my work because I really tend to work in volume. I'm prolific in this way. I do a lot of printing, and I often develop these color schemes that you really kind of need to see the work as a collection. So this work, borrows from a variety of styles and genres. It's this kind of sprinkling of people, places, animals, still lifes. And it's a series that not only contains emotional possibility, it has these different narratives happening, but it's really about the experience of emotional possibility. And this is what I mean about being a bit obsessed with this idea of uncertainty. So this work kind of began as a search for what at that time I had described as a very particular feeling. So I was sort of getting into my bachelor thesis, and I was like, there are feelings that we have a name for, we have words for them. So happiness, sadness, joy, all the feelings you can name, these feelings. And there are feelings that I really think that they exist, but they live sort of underneath what can be described, at least by a single word or a set of words. And so I was always interested in what I described as the feeling underneath feelings. So I would often describe that as the kind of wave of emotion that is often beyond language and beyond conscious thought, but something that's very recognizable. Like you know it because you feel it, but you don't have a specific name for it. Does that make sense? So someone in my audience a couple of years ago described that as like a mother feeling, and I really liked that expression of it. So I was really interested in like this, like, could you visualize this? Could you represent this thing? So that was the inspiration, and maybe that's just like the nature of feeling. Maybe it's not a particular feeling, but that was the sort of how I had approached making the work. And although the work was always sort of about this nature, over time, I think it really developed into a deeper reflection on things like mortality and loss and absence. And it had this kind of bent to it. So sometimes it's really, I look at it and I think, oh, this work is about, the act of leaving and letting go. And other times it's like an inability to move on, right? It's a sort of meditation on internal behavior and mind states. But the idea of uncertainty is always present, because I try not to make work that you could look at and say, this is this one particular feeling. Like, I like to have a certain degree of ambiguity, because to me that defines the nature of feeling. And so I always think that like both the subject and the print kind of speak to this meditation. So like these photographs have this aesthetic, it's like this aesthetic of decay, of being weathered and being kind of damaged, which, actually they're not at all. They have multiple layers of toner. And if anyone's been working with toners, you know that toners tend to increase the archival quality of your work, right? So, for example, if you tone your silver gelatin prints in selenium, it'll increase the life of those prints, right? You can also give it a tone, but it will increase the life. And so, they actually have a lot of life as photographic objects, but they look kind of weathered and damaged, right? They have this aesthetic. So the sort of seeming or apparent fading of the print is really meant to sort of parallel the fading of the subject, right? Like it's sort of, and both of these things are this maybe metaphor for emotional loss. But there's also a reference in this work to the disappearance of the analog image. At the time that I was making this work, I don't know if you guys remember, but it was like 2009, 2010. There was like really this big conversation about like, what is the future of chemical photography, right? And it's a valid question, but we didn't really know at that time, like what materials would be available, how possible was it going to be to continue working in this way. So I think now that's changed a bit, like we sort of have a sense of where chemical photography is at, and like we can still get materials. But at that time, I would say that was a big concern, right? Like Kodak was shutting down a lot of its facilities. A lot of companies were sort of stopping different production of papers and chemicals, and especially with C printing, right? Like with analog C printing, which is one of my favorite processes and why I chose the graduate school that I did. We thought like, how are people going to be able to continue to maintain darkrooms? And I would say that's the one medium where it didn't quite get maintained. It sort of got rerouted into digital C prints. So you still have the papers and chemicals being produced, but not as much access to the color darkrooms. Sorry, a chromogenic print, an analog color darkroom printing, which is just a beautiful, slow, it's an amazing process, and a great way to learn color balance. So some images are sort of latent and indistinct, and other images are more clear, they're more definite, you can really see what they are. And I think this rhythm that I try to create through aesthetic variation is a really common strategy in my work. So I use this sort of aesthetic variation and rhythm to create these kind of emotional fluctuations. So it's how I sort of address the emotional landscape and this idea of uncertainty and instability within it, right? Like you go here and then you go here. You have something readable and then something not legible at all. And in particular, it's how I explore this kind of interest in uncertainty, because I really consider uncertainty to be like the defining part of the human condition. Like I feel like for me, attempting to deal with and to manage uncertainty, like maybe I'm just anxious, but like for me, it's the basis of so much of what we do and the stories that we tell, like myth and religion viewed from a perspective are like an attempt to give structure and to answer questions that we actually struggle with and we actually can't know for sure, right? But they give us a sort of a structure and a sense of certainty, right? So I think about uncertainty as, and accepting uncertainty as one of the biggest sort of challenges that we face. So this was my bachelor thesis, my first professional body of work. At the time, I was only showing in a few group shows. I really didn't have exhibition experience. I didn't have a gallery to show in. But I wanted to hang this work before our thesis show because I really wanted to see it as like one body, you know? And so I cleared out a storage room in the university. A couple of friends and I painted it. We hung the show. And I really just tried to create a little exhibition where I could really step back and see the work. And that was really important to me, to see the collection, because I was only really seeing it in tiny pieces on the wall and then otherwise kind of on floors and tables and, you know. And so I did this. And I also here you can see this here. So at the time I was also working with a bit of 16mm film, and I was really just making moving portraits. Like when I was shooting my portraits, I was also just shooting some 16mm and just like, you know, how I had a fan going and I just had them kind of moving around, and I was just playing with the medium. And I really liked some of the snippets, but I wanted the film to match like the tonality of the images. So I just toned a piece of photographic paper and I projected onto a toned piece of photo paper. And in that way, I sort of kept the aesthetic of the 16mm film. Does that make sense? I just toned what it was projected on and not the film itself, because I like to maintain my originals. And it would have been harder. But so I did that. And you have here, so I was doing a lot of silver gelatin, and there's a lot of sea prints here too. And I have here a lot of salted paper prints. So I really was digging into more historical processes as well. So I really consider this project, it was my first major project, and it really became for me like a kind of archive of photographic experimentation, right? Like, I mean, I was just playing constantly. So before I go to my sort of more significant body of work, because this Koja work I did for 7 years, which is like, you know, the majority of my career really, I did a few other projects, and I just want to highlight them because I maybe kind of want to show how my interests have expanded into other like visual expressions. So after my BFA, I moved to Arizona where I did my master's degree, and I had been working with these really like, you know, process-based images for like several years now, and I'd had like some success with it. But at this time, I started to get really like hesitant to keep doing that because, and I don't know if anyone can relate to this experience, but I sort of felt that it was like becoming a crutch. Like I basically had some success doing this process-based work, and then I felt like I had started to just do it because, I don't know, like it was just what I did. And there's nothing actually maybe wrong with that, but I just didn't want to do that, right? Because I'm interested in experimentation and like what are the limits of the photograph, right? So for my interest, that didn't work. So I really started to crave just like rectangular color balanced photography, you know? I was like, wow. And so that was what I sort of set my mind to when I was doing my master's thesis. I got really into large format slide film because I'm still like loving analog technologies and I love the materiality of that. So that was a great way for me to do both things, to kind of make straighter photography. But then I was also working with these gorgeous, huge negatives. And I have some of those negatives here if you want to see them. So as a sort of natural extension of what I had always been interested in, this sort of nature of feeling, this emotional landscape, I really started to think about these themes of like intimacy and regeneration, and how do we actually define intimacy? Because it's actually, I think, a more complex concept than it seems. And so I started seeking out experiences that I felt would give me sort of insight into intimacy. So I was, for example, for a while, I was always on call because I was attending births at a women's center. Like I had connected with a bunch of women at the center, and I was just sort of getting calls at any time of day or night, like, okay, it's happening, you know, and then I would get ready and I would go, and sometimes they were like, sorry, the baby already came, and sometimes, you know, I would see it. So, which you can't be mad about. Like one woman gave birth in like 10 minutes, and I was like, well, that's great for you, you know? So I was really happy for her. But I ended up, doing things like this. I was also going to strip clubs, going to peep shows, going to morgue. And so I was doing all of these things. I was also photographing people in bed together. So I was spending a lot of time, for example, with couples, getting to know them, thinking about the boundaries of these shoots, and then working in that way. So it was a really interesting time in my life, and it had a lot of meaning because I was communicating with people in a totally different way. So I was really looking at any place we're really confronted with the body in this kind of intimate way. And what I really came out with in the end was images that were like, at the same time they were intimate, they also tended to be like very abject, right? Like they had this disgust associated with them. Not always, but a lot of the time. And that sort of made sense to me because I think I came to define intimacy as a sort of space of emotional intersection. Like it's not one thing, it's rather a meeting place for different feelings and different judgments. So like intimacy is neither sacred nor profane. It's neither safe nor vulnerable. It's kind of all of those things cooperating, interacting, conflicting. And I think maybe the best example of this is if you think about getting into a relationship. When your relationship starts to become serious, I think a big part of that intimacy is like learning to deal with the grossness of the body. Like the body can be gross, and like not in a bad way. It's a body, and you learn to deal with the sort of grossness of each other's bodies. And that when you can do that with someone, like that's a very meaningful sign that you are like truly intimate with that person, right? And so that's maybe one example of that. So a lot of this was just sort of popping up in the work. So I did that work. I graduate. I have like no idea what to do. I came back to Canada for a little bit, and I'm working a lot of odd jobs, but still producing a lot of work. I start spending time in Slovakia because my partner at that time was Slovak, and that's how I came to the country. And I started to work on Koja, but somewhere in between, I did a residency in Iceland. And I took a sort of 6-month break from Koja, and I did this residency, and then right away I printed the work for exhibition at the Scotiabank Contact Photography Festival, which is a very worthwhile festival of seeing and applying to if you're interested. So this was really the quickest body of work I ever made, like start to finish 6 months. But I had like every day of those 6 months to work on it, and I had a lot of institutional support. So despite that really tight timeline, I think it was one of my most cohesive exhibitions. So I came to Iceland for 3 months in the winter, and I was a resident at a place called Listus. And Listus is in a town called Ólafsfjörður, and it's in the northeast of Iceland. It's about 40 kilometers from the Arctic Circle. So super cold, super dark in the winter. And the residency was part of a festival known as Skamdegi, which means dark days. And basically during this time, the sun never rises above the mountains, and it doesn't shine. The sun doesn't shine for like more than 4 hours a day in that darkest period. And so when artists come there, they really are often responding to this experience of living in darkness. Like even when it's light out, it's not that light out. You know what I mean? So you're really living in a lot of darkness, and you're kind of alone with your thoughts in a lot of ways. So I created this work from it. It was an expression of that experience. I was photographing a lot of the other artists. So it's called The Story of You. And this work, like, it sort of functions, because when you're in that kind of environment, you really have like time with your thoughts. And so the work sort of functions as a mind, sort of scanning through moments of personal history, marked by, again, these themes of uncertainty, desire, regret. This was also my first experience working with neon. It was my first neon work, which I've come to work with a lot. And it's become a really important medium for me. You know, I love neon because it has this like, it's like an industrial medium, but it has this heavenly glow, you know, that for me just like totally speaks to the kind of experience that I'm sort of taken by, but also try to recreate in my own work. And then I'm working again on Koja, but in 2021, I go to Landskrona photo residency. This was part of PH Museum grant, and I did a project that I don't really have a title for yet, but I just call it Strangers for now. And basically I spent 6 weeks there, and I did a kind of social experiment there. So it was a 6-week program, and I hired 4 models that had never met each other. And at this time in Sweden, we were really sort of coming out of the pandemic. Like you could, it was different in different parts of the world, but we could, people could connect in this way. We had precautions in place, but it was sort of at that time, sort of okay to connect with people, but also there was this feeling of like cautious connection, cautious intimacy, which I think is smart. And so I hired these models. They were strangers to one another, and I set up opportunities for connection. So like a meal, a film, a dance party, a card game, a walk. And I used photography to sort of document their emergent relationships. Again, I sort of went back to like straighter photography, large format slide film, because I had been, again, working in this really process-based way for a while, and I wanted a bit of a break. And this sort of suited the project. So I was working with a lot of this large format slide. And so there was really this idea for me, again, of going back to the concept of intimacy. Like, what is it, and how is it created, and how do we look at intimacy, I think, in like pandemic times, and like how, so, the health crisis on the one hand, it sort of created these huge lapses in human connection, but on the other hand, it sort of made us think about how vital it is and what it means and how we can cultivate it. And I think this approach to portraiture really lies somewhere between like what is posed and what is candid, right? There's, on the one hand, I'm setting up an experience, right? I'm creating an opportunity for connection, but it's a stage on which anything might unfold, any dynamic. Like I have no way of knowing whether they'll like each other or whether they'll have similar beliefs or views. Will they fight? Will they continue to be friends after? Like, I think it was really much about like what will happen, right? So it was also an environment of uncertainty. So it was a really sort of interesting social project for me. So Koja Women and Other Stories. So it's my longest running project. I haven't addressed much the theme of archives and iteration so far, which is, what this is, but I kind of wanted to bring that all together here. So I really wanted to lay the foundation. I do work with archives, both personal and institutional. And Koja Women and Other Stories began in 2015. It's a collection of hundreds of images, interwoven narratives that, again, explore connection, uncertainty, desire, right? So this is kind of like my life theme so far. The work began when I first moved to Slovakia in 2015. It's a sort of poetic expression of my travels in the last 7 years. Although it's photo-based, I also began working a lot more with neon in this work. And it's really important to me that the neon texts are sort of embodying or signaling the emotional trajectory of the work. So this one says chaos, unrest, uncertainty, longing, hesitation, desire, you or something like it. This is an exhibition I did at Bistro. So I was moving around a lot at this time. I spent 2015 sort of like teaching English, and it was a flexible job. It allowed me to sort of travel around Europe. I returned home to Canada. I crossed Canada, and then I left for Central America for a while, and then eventually I made my way back to Slovakia in 2018, and I've sort of been here ever since. And I guess, as you all know, this word koja means skin. I only have to explain that, I guess, to international audiences. But this was obviously a reference to the birthplace of the work. And I really felt that it should be referenced in the title. And so in this work, I'm also really experimenting heavily in the darkroom, expired papers, toners, lith developers. So the process is really meant to be like a kind of representation of the title, like this idea of the print as a kind of skin, a covering, a sort of body that is housing this emotional content. And just an example, I talked a bit about iterations. I'll talk about it a bit more later, but I often reprint a negative and give it a sort of different aesthetic, or I alter it slightly, and that could have to do with toning or cropping, but it's something that sort of keeps the act of printing really exciting for me. So in this work, I'm really sort of documenting the unfolding of this experience, the sort of unfolding narrative, which is often disjointed and retold into this story of companionship and isolation. These images were taken at a cave in Guatemala. So the images are really tracking this kind of body moving through space, you know, collecting stories, collecting experiences. This particular diptych is actually one negative, but I separated it into two prints, which I think just works much better for this particular image aesthetically. This is a church in the Faroe Islands. So there's a range of kind of moods that are really meant to make up this work. Again, a sort of moving back and forth between different processes. This is a cyanotype. Fog lifting off a distant volcano, right? Something very serene. But then I might come in and I might match it with something, you know, totally different. Something more chaotic or direct, or erotic even. So I would describe this work really as about this forming of emotional puzzles that, like, you know, because it's such a large archive, you know, the puzzles come together again to form something and then they break apart and then maybe they meet back up again, but in a slightly different way. Also, you know, these are moments in time, but often I'm sort of obscuring like when and where the actual image might be from. Like you could date this for, you know, 2019, but you could even, upon first look, date it like significantly earlier. And also make these references to a broader frame, like moments in time, but with this idea that there is something else sort of beyond it. I mean, I've always loved, I always include, not always, but I usually include borders in my prints, and I love playing with the borders and using the borders as another kind of visual canvas that I can play on. So around 2017, I connected with the Archive of Modern Conflict, and I started photographing objects in their collection. It's a really interesting place. So the AMC began actually as a repository for conflict imagery, but it's since expanded to include all manner of art and ephemera. The AMC has a really huge collection of Czechoslovak photography. So they have like a lot of the masters, like they have tons of Svoboda and Tichy and Sudek, but they also have like a massive collection of like vernacular Czechoslovak photography. And so like everyday family archives. And this was really interesting to me because I was now living here in Bratislava, and it looked like, you know, I was going to stay and that this would be my home. So I was going through a lot of this material, and I had always loved the Czechoslovak tradition of photography. Like for me, that was always a tradition from a young sort of age that I really was drawn towards. And so I was looking through a lot of this material and also feeling like that there were pieces and traces in them of the place that I was now living, right? And so it was really interesting for me in terms of contextualizing my new surroundings. I didn't adopt those images into the work, as I said. I just spent a lot of time with them. In terms of actually photographing objects in the AMC, it allowed me to take the narrative that I had been documenting, exploring, and put it beyond my own experience. So what I was doing at the archive was really like referencing a broader world, relics of a broader world. But I will tell a little story about this image. So the first week that I had come to Slovakia in 2015, my ex and I we had an apartment ready we were going to move into. And we come into the apartment and the landlord is like, oh, don't worry about the stuff in that room. It was like this little room off the bathroom. I'm going to throw all that away later. And we were like, okay. And I looked into it. We looked into it. It's a dark room. And we were like, oh, well, can we keep it? You know? And I was like, perfect. You know, I don't need to manage this. It's here. And the guy was like, yeah, great. Like, less work for me, right? So we actually had like a ready-made darkroom there. And it had like all of these really old Czechoslovak and Hungarian papers, like some really expired stuff. You know, it wasn't like kept in the fridge or anything, but had some really interesting stuff. So this image, for example, is just that piece of paper. So I'm doing a lot of this experimentation. I really consider this darkroom, this sort of like collection of old papers that, I otherwise really wouldn't have had access to. To me, this was also another kind of archive, This was somebody's like personal darkroom that we just sort of managed to take and to use and to add to in some way. So a lot of narrative possibility. I think for me, I keep saying like narrative possibility. It's like another way also of saying like uncertainty, right? I'm really interested in like how to discover increasingly complex combinations of feeling. So I'm really interested in like what are the visual constraints of the emotional landscape? Like how deep can you go in terms of this representation? So if I give you an example, like say I take the idea of longing, right? And I say like, show me a picture of longing. I think you could really easily do that in like a million ways. Like show me a picture of longing. Sure. Here's two people about to kiss, like you could do that so many ways. It wouldn't be difficult, right? But how deep could you go? Like what if I said, show me a picture of the fantasy of an apology, right? And like that is a very human experience. Like this feeling that I think maybe I hope not, but I think most people have probably had, that they're like, I just want an apology. You know what I mean? And they think about it and they have this idea of it and like what it would mean to them to have this thing. And it's like you've had that experience, right? Okay, so I'm like, it's not just me. It's a very human experience, but how would you photograph that? Like it's easy that is a kind of longing. It's easy to showcase longing, but it's like, how deep can you go? How complex can you get? And so I'm really interested in like, what are the limitations of photography, but also art in general in like representing those things? And I investigate these boundaries through this fluctuation, like through this aesthetic variation. I'm not saying it's a solution, but it's sort of like how I try to dig deeper into feelings that are difficult to name, difficult to represent, right? Emotional rhythms created through disparate scenes, disparate gestures. I sometimes sort of say that my work is sort of akin to the experience of visiting an antique store. So like you go to an antique shop, right? And everything in that shop sort of feels like it belongs together. Do you know what I mean? Like when you go into like an antique store, everything kind of feels like it fits. It's like everything is united by this shared space or this shared feeling of time having passed, right? But in reality, like all of the objects in that store are like made from different eras, potentially different geographies, different makers, different cultures. Like they're very disparate items, but they often have this like sense of solidarity to them. They feel like they belong. And so I sometimes describe my own sort of imagery that way, that like my images sort of live together, but their story is in no way singular. Like my images sit on the shelf of this store. They sit like objects on the shelf of this store. Right. And again, images that exist somewhere between what is posed and what is candid. This sort of fluctuation of processes, states of mind, framing, cropping, size. Right. A friend had said to me, like, when I was discussing this project years ago now, but like that there was elevation of the everyday in the work. And I would say that that's kind of true because in a big way, like I would say a lot of the scenes that I'm showing in my images, like they're not exceptional scenes per se, right? Like they're just moments, they're kind of moments in time. And so, a body resting on a bed, like a wall in a public space is a Slovak radio building. But I think it's in the way that the works are organized and in the treatment of the prints that like the photograph really becomes this sort of tool for, emotional exploration. So I had did this living research because I really wanted to experience the world in a more potent way. That's what I'd been doing in Tucson, beyond theory. And I sort of continued that bent in this work. In this medium, you spend a lot of, the purpose of this medium is also to be a witness to things, right? Witness is a big word in photo theory. We are witnesses as photographers. And so you spend a lot of time being a witness, you sort of collect different stories. And I think that can actually be quite challenging. Like, I think that's one of the challenges that you can come up against as a photographer, because I think experience can very easily become this secondhand phenomena, if that makes sense. Like, put simply, you don't always do things, rather you record things being done. And I was always sort of like, in a way, like, I accept that because it's part of the medium, but in a way I was always sort of like challenged by that idea, like how to really be in the world, but also to photograph it, right? This idea, like, what are you? Like, are you a witness? Are you an actor? Can you be both? So I've often sort of sought out experiences that for me have informed my practice. So yeah, I'm shooting life as I live it, but then I'm also cultivating experiences where I can photograph and also get some kind of personal experience from it, you know? So it's like shooting life as I live it, but also shooting in order to live, or like shooting in order to have a particular experience. And, you know, one of the things that, I don't know, maybe you've seen or has popped up a little bit, is that I also tend to really repeat images, scenes, objects in my work. Like, I sort of make a lot of iterations of any given negative. And this is, I think, a sort of great example of that. So this was like one shoot that I did. You know, this was like a half an hour shoot, one roll of film, I think, and I really printed like almost everything on that roll, but I printed them and I printed them and then I printed them again, and I created a lot of iterations. And for a long time, this model was really like the face of the Koja work. Like, it was what I used in most of my promo materials. It was it was kind of like the work evolved around this particular character. It's since expanded a little bit, but I really love this idea of like making prints from the same negative, but changing them slightly, and then maybe taking other like images from that shoot and making them kind of similar, but kind of different, so that you don't always, is it the same? Is it different? So that there's kind of this like ambiguity over like what is coming from where, and is it the same or isn't it? And part of the reason, and then sometimes I'll make like a negative look totally different, like one print from the same negative look totally different from the other. And I guess I'm a huge believer that your negative should live different lives. Like, I love the idea that every time you make a print, your negative gets this opportunity to live a new life and to offer a new experience. And so I really value that kind of materiality and that capacity for change. So I had mentioned before when I was showing my grad school work to pay attention to that blue piece. So that blue image is a large format Polaroid gone wrong. So basically, I don't know what happened, but something happened chemically, and what came out of an actual scene that I was trying to shoot was just blue. And so I was like, oh, who cares? This is great. It's so nice, you know? So I kept it. I had used it as a Polaroid for a while. And then I get into grad school, and I made it in like 2011, but in 2014, I'm doing my grad work, and I'm like, I love this idea of a blue color field. You know, I'm talking about intimacy. It can be a kind of pause in what is otherwise some really kind of like very direct and like, you know, hit you in the head kind of work, right? So I love the idea of using it. So I scanned the Polaroid. I made a super large format inkjet print from it. So I do use digital processes, but often as like some kind of medium between another, some kind of, in order to help me visualize something in an analog way, let's say. I printed it really large and I face mounted it to plexi, so it was super high gloss. And that was great. I really enjoyed doing that. I really loved that piece. And then like I'm working on Koja again, and I'm working on the exhibition for Arles, which was canceled due to pandemic, but this is how it came about. And I'm like, oh, I kind of missed that blueprint, you know? And so then I started reprinting it, and then I started cutting it into triangles and adding collage to it. And I ended up I'll show you some more pictures with them, but I have so many iterations of just this image, because for me, it does something different for me each time. And so I've really been obsessed with this kind of work as a color field, you know, but really and the fact that it comes from a Polaroid, you know, like a messed up Polaroid is so interesting for me. And, you know, it's like 12 years later and I'm still using this image, you know, and I really feel like I haven't used it in the same way. I feel like I've breathed new life into it. And I sort of love that idea. On the same note, I showed an image of a leaf. This is a screen print of that leaf. I'm super into printed matter, probably because I love the idea of iterations, right? So that's why I love screen printing. It's also a negative positive process. I love the way that you screen print. And so I often screen print a lot of my images. And again, it's just another way to like breathe life into them. I have variable editioning, which means that if I say I'm going to print a negative if 10 times, each one is actually potentially unique. So the 1 of 10 might be this image. 2 of 10 of the same negative might be like just her eye. And that's number 2, right? So, and then number 3 might be this, but printed as a salted paper print, right? So I mix it up each time, and that really keeps the act of printing exciting for me and really interesting for me. And it just really speaks to this idea of changeability and uncertainty. Like it really is this sort of core element of my practice. So I love editioning that way. This is another neon I did, and I was showing this last year at the Coniatic Gallery in Trnava, which was really exciting. I had produced another neon for this, and I had changed around the dimensions and created a new text piece. This is another image with the triangles, so I also had like an ivory color field, and I started like producing these white ones, and so I got really into this whole these shapes at one point. This one's actually from a piece of large format slide film. And so again, I'm just sort of reimagining the work. Every exhibition is yet another opportunity for the work to sort of live a new life, and that's really important to me. So even when I exhibit a work that is already made, I usually do something new for it. I like the idea of like giving it that new bent. And this is just, I showed this image in the beginning. This is just another installation shot of that show at Bistro, but this is at night. So because the neon was really filling the space as the daylight changed, right? As it changed from day to night, the space got like more red, right? Whereas earlier it was like kind of pinky blue. And so I also love this idea that like the exhibition itself was changing, right? Because again, it's this idea of changeability, uncertainty, mutability. Right?